welcome to A Novel Idea, the show where we interview authors. My name is Noelle Bach. I am the host of the show and also the library director here in the town of Danvers. And today we are welcoming Lee McIntyre. Welcome, Lee.
Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on down. Now, we're going to talk about your latest book, which is called On Disinformation: How to Fight for Truth and Protect Democracy. So I guess the very first question to ask is, what inspired you to write this story? Or it's not a story, but...
Yeah. The short answer is January 6th. The longer answer is that I had just finished writing a book, published a book, was out doing publicity for it, called How to Talk to a Science Denier, because I'm a philosopher of science and I was interested in how it was that people were climate deniers or anti-vax or flat earthers, all these different things. And what I discovered was that there was a technique of reasoning that they all used. It was identical. And then I realized that that was the same technique that was now happening in American politics, the strategic denialism. And it wasn't just destroying science anymore. It was threatened to destroy democracy. And that's when I kind of woke up and said, there's another piece to this puzzle. I put this whole puzzle together and there was still a little piece, a small piece sitting on the floor. And that was the new book, just to extend what I had said before about science denial now for what I call reality denial.
And yes, there's lots of it, as we've seen. And as a librarian, I work with a lot of information. Obviously, that's like what we work in. And to see, some people have opinions, really, or talk about conspiracies. Like I've had people come and sit in my office and just spout conspiracy theories to me, and you just have to sort of say like, okay, well, and it's say like the very thing that I think is super interesting, like trying to read through your book of all the points you have at the end. Give it all away, since we want people to buy your book or read your book. But it's like all these different efforts. Like, what can you really do to talk to somebody who is immersed in this disinformation? And I was really interested in your book with how it all started when you're talking about with cigarettes and like that campaign. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Of course, yes. So there's actually a date I can give you. December 15th, 1953 is when modern science denial really started, because that was the day that the heads of the largest tobacco companies in the U.S. met at the Plaza Hotel in New York City, because there was a forthcoming study that was going to show that there was a link between smoking and lung cancer. And this would kill their business. They needed to know what to do. And so they hired a public relations expert to come in and advise them. And his advice was, fight the science. Now, interesting, he didn't say, do science, show what's wrong with these studies in a scientific way. He meant fight it through public relations, which they did, and they created doubt where there was none. And there's a wonderful book on this by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway called Merchants of Doubt, which tells the story of how that battle plan that was put together in the 1950s really became the blueprint for all modern science denial, for climate denial, for anti-vax. They all followed that same blueprint, because maybe you and I think that's all a joke and why would anybody fall for it and pay attention to it. But it was wildly successful. And it results in some of the problems that we see today, where the folks show up in your office and we don't know what to say because they're disinformed. They're lied to, really.
Yes. And reading through the book, I was taken with also the point that you make about how so few people can provide this disinformation, and yet the spread of it is so wide that people buy into it. And do you have a good feeling of like why so many people want to believe the disinformation?
I'm not sure it's that they want to believe. I mean, we've all got cognitive biases in our head that, if somebody knows what they are, they can, try to exploit it. And one of the worst cognitive biases we have is we want to be right. So, you know, we'll go out and look for evidence to back up the thing that we already think is true rather than to test it and see if it's really true. And the disinformers know this. I think of disinformation as a pipeline. It starts with the creators, it goes to the amplifiers, and it ends with the believers. People create disinformation, which is false, intentionally false information that they spread, because it serves their interests. They get something out of it, sometimes money, the case with the tobacco companies or the fossil fuel companies for climate change, or power, or, you know, ideological verification, something like that. You know, the people create disinformation because they get something out of it. And people believe it because they're victims. And I think they deserve our empathy, which is a really hard thing to say because sometimes the conversations can be so offensive. But one thing that I learned in the research for my earlier book, How to Talk to a Science Denier, is that if you think of science deniers as victims, like somebody who caught a disease, then they really do deserve some calm, patient respect in conversation with them. And plus, that's maybe the only thing that's ever going to get them out of it. Because if you insult somebody, they're not going to listen. Disinformation doesn't just share falsehood, it erodes trust. And it makes you distrust and maybe even hate the people who don't agree with you. Now, I left something out in the middle, and it's the most important step, the amplifiers.
Right.
The amplifiers, in my view, are in some ways almost the worst people. Some are witting, some are unwitting. It's the witting ones that upset me because very few people can make a lot of trouble. The Center for Countering Digital Hate found in 2019 that 65% of the anti-vax propaganda on Twitter was due to 12 people. 12. Can they deplatform those 12 people, please? You know, and the night before Elon Musk took over at Twitter, I checked, and 8 of them were still platformed.
Wow.
Now, one of them is RFK Jr. Now, he seems like a true believer. So maybe you'd think he's a victim himself. Was he witting or unwitting? Does he really believe this stuff? Okay, we can ask that question. So a story just came out in the New York Times, I think it was yesterday, about the amount of money that he makes on boards and speeches and such. So, you know, we need to dig in, not just deplatform people because we don't like what they're saying, but try to figure out what's motivating them to share a lie on Twitter, because they're doing incredible damage. I mean, people died during COVID because they didn't take their vaccines, and some people profited from that. And that sounds like a horrible scandal or a conspiracy theory. But I've got the goods. I know who did it and can share that with you if you're interested.
Yeah, well, I'd be interested.
Okay.
I'd like to
all right.
hear that.
After that tease, how could you turn me down, it would seem. We've all heard the false claim that there are microchips, tracking microchips in the COVID vaccines. And, you know, many people believe this, and when I give a speech in a ballroom, you know, I'll ask how many people have heard this, and almost every hand goes up. And then I ask how many of you know where that came from? And I've only twice had people raise their hand, and both times they were military. You know, one guy was military intelligence. Because the answer to where that came from was that it was amplified, at least, and probably also invented, from a Russian troll farm. The idea that there were tracking microchips first appeared in print in April 2020 in an online publication called the Oriental Review. And it's English language, and it said any future vaccines developed in the West will have tracking microchips in them courtesy of Bill Gates, who has patent 666 on this technology. It said some other scandalous things, and at the end it said share on Facebook, share on Twitter. The following month, 28% of the American public thought there was something to this story. Now you do the math and you think 1 million people died during COVID. How many of them were anti-vaxxers who were afraid of something? How many of them were people who believed that idea? And what it never said in the Oriental Review is that that's a propaganda arm of the SVR, which is today's inheritor of the KGB. They did it on purpose to destabilize American society. Yes, we've been in an information war with Russia, especially over science, for 20 years now. But they had a competing vaccine called the Sputnik. I mean, just think what's at stake there. The Sputnik, there's some national pride there.
Right, yeah.
So that they, 5 months before the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, were out there denigrating what they would be because they wanted to sell the Sputnik vaccine. Very lucrative market for the people who got there first. So it was both money and ideology and power, all three. So, and once you expose that story, people wonder, why haven't I heard this? And the reason is because cable news never picked it up. It was a one-day story in the Wall Street Journal behind a paywall.
Right.
And I forget who said it, but recently I heard somebody else said this to me, that we now live in an era in which the truth is behind a paywall and the lies are free.
Oh, I love that.
So people, I wish I'd invented that statement,
yeah,
but I mean, so people don't know the truth.
Right, right. And you also talk about in your book this idea, since you just happened to touch upon the media as well, of media trying to say, oh, we're showing both sides,
yes,
and how that's just not, it's harmful both ways. Like either we know that there's bias in the media already and that they tend to be on a side or the other, quite obviously, I usually feel. But then the ones who are trying to say, oh, well, let's make sure we're showing both sides, are actually doing a disservice to this information because they're helping to amplify, again, the wrong information, and instead of saying, no, this is the truth.
And it's that's particularly heartbreaking because we all understand that disinformation can be amplified on social media and how that happens. And we all understand also that there's such a thing as partisan media, where they're going to share a falsehood and amplify it knowing that it's false because it again serves their interests. What's really heartbreaking are the media outlets who are not doing that, but nonetheless amplify the disinformation. One way that they do a harm is by calling it misinformation. Because once you say misinformation, then it sounds like an accident. But it's not an accident, it's a lie. And so if you don't report on it that way, then people miss that. But the real problem is that you think about, partisan journalists don't worry about being accused of being politically biased. But real journalists do. And so the easiest way to show that you're not politically biased is to have both sides on and let them talk. But that's the worst possible way to cover a factual matter. I mean, you don't have a NASA launch and then you have equal time with the flat earthers saying it's all a fake. I mean, you don't report it that way. And there are some networks, three-letter networks out there that are still doing it this way. And Soledad O'Brien, who used to be on CNN, said, this is simple. Don't book liars on your program. Don't give them a chance to amplify, because once you give them a microphone, you're enabling that. You're making it worse. So there's a way in which even mainstream media, when they're trying, can still amplify the other quotation. Again, I didn't say this. I'm giving you all the nice things that I didn't think of, but I'll give credit. This one is, I think it's Stuart Stevens in his new book, said, how do you tell both sides of a lie? You can't have a split screen and let both sides talk because one side is lying.
Right, right. And that's, feels like there's so much of that out there. And the piece I was reading near the end of your book, where you're trying to give all of these possible ways to help fight back against the disinformation piece, and I was still reading that and going well, where do I really start though with this? Because there's so much of it out there, and certainly there's people I know and are friendly with who have told me right to my face some piece of disinformation, they're repeating it. And they're saying, oh, and I think one of the other pieces that ties into all of this too is, and you talk about a bit too, is the I'm right piece, right, that we kind of talked about before. And like a friend of mine and I had a conversation around QAnon one time where he said he'd read an article, I wonder if you'd read it too, it was about a video game programmer wrote the article, and he was saying that QAnon is set up like a video game, right, so that you're having to solve things. They're giving you enough information that you still have to go solve the level yourself.
That's right.
And then, so you feel a sense of pride and achievement.
It's wired right in,
right
that
there, right?
Pattern seeking.
Yes.
In the human brain, we're going to find a pattern.
Yes. And then he talks about, then you level up, right? Like, so then you're like, okay, I found this information, or I did it myself. Now I'm going to go to the next level and find the next level on. And, you know, my friend and I were talking about this, and I was sort of like, well, how do you dismantle someone's, you know, those little pops in their brain of happiness of getting to these different levels with actual information that's going to make them feel also that way.
You put that way, you almost can't.
Right?
You know, how do you give them that dopamine hit, the same as what you described there? But I guess I think of it that there are two different ways to approach it. You can have empathy and have conversations and try to help people who have already gone down the rabbit hole. That was the earlier book, How to Talk to a Science Denier. Patient, face-to-face, warm conversation. That's the only thing that has ever worked to bring somebody back. It's the same technique they use to bring people out of cults. I mean, you don't insult them, you don't tell them, you know, you're being lied to, you show them love and respect, and then they trust you, maybe, and then they can get back out of it. So that's one way to approach it. The thing that I worried about, and one motivation for writing On Disinformation, is that solution is not completely scalable. It's all one step behind. Imagine fighting a pandemic where all we were doing was treating the sick, and we never tried to figure out why they were getting sick.
Right.
I mean, we're doing the right thing to treat the sick. Can we spend a little bit of time trying to find out which pump handle is, you know, infecting everybody?
Right.
That's what the new book is about. The new book is about how to fight back against disinformation, not just by talking to people who have already heard it and become infected by it, but by fighting against its amplification. Because the real way to fight disinformation is not to let people hear it in the first place.
Right.
Once they've heard it, very difficult to get them to give it up. Mark Twain said that it's easier to fool somebody than to convince them that they've been fooled. But how can we keep them from hearing it? Maybe we could deplatform some of those disinformers on Twitter. Now, there has been a lot of pushback recently about fighting disinformation. Isn't this interfering with free speech? Isn't this censorship? That too has been a kind of a disinformation campaign, I think, because it's to pretend that there's no such thing as amplification. Twitter and Facebook amplify someone else's lie. So they're culpable. Maybe they didn't invent it, but they're getting something out of it if their algorithms are telling them to push the thing that's engaging. So, when Elon Musk says, oh, but this is just censorship. No, refusing to amplify someone else's lie is not censorship. If you were a radical free speech person and the Ku Klux Klan wanted a rally permit, you might think, I hate what their message is, but we have to give them the permit. The First Amendment, says this, and you've seen those kind of stories in the media.
Yes.
What's not required is to go down to the rally and help them hand out flyers.
Right.
And that's what Facebook and Twitter are doing. They're amplifying. In that case, it was a message of hate. In this other instance, a message of disinformation. They can be related. But the point is, we've got to try to do something about the amplification problem, because that's where I think we're really going to solve this. If anything's going to solve this, it's going to be when we figure out how to stop amplifying disinformation.
Yeah, and I always have found it interesting, like during the elections cycles, right, where the news will do here's the speaker, this candidate is speaking about a certain thing, and then they're tracking if what they're saying is true or not. Like they have those kind of like truth meters, like that go along with that, and it works on both sides, right? Like not saying like anyone is immune from that. Like even the candidate you like is probably saying something less than truthful, some of the time. But I find those very interesting to look at, to see, because as they're speaking, the politicians, right, are of course trying to benefit themselves, right, and so they're going to twist perhaps something that they're saying to make it look good for themselves or against their other. Right?
They fact check them in real time. I mean, I've seen those meters at the bottom, but they're meters for audience response. You're saying that there are meters to fact check them in real time. I love that.
Yes.
I love that idea.
Yeah, so that's definitely out there. So you can look online and like see. They try to keep up with the conversation. Be like, here's what they were saying, and here's. I mean, you can. And the next day you can look at it too. If you didn't catch one at the time.
It's content moderate. That's what the social media companies were doing for about a second.
Right.
Before the 2020 election, they were content moderating around the pandemic. Disinformation about the pandemic and about the 2020 election. But then once the election was over, they kind of stopped doing it. And if you look now at Twitter, Musk has fired his whole trust and safety council team. And Facebook, they used to have a committee for, God, I forget what it's called, responsible innovation, something like that. I mean, they're just not doing as much because the incentive is not there. I mean, Twitter has set such a, I should say X now, they've set such a low bar that if the companies are profiting from disinformation, why should they do anything? They too denied for a long time. Mark Zuckerberg, said to claims that Russian disinformation had influenced the 2016 presidential election. He said that was crazy. In 2017, it came out that 126 million people saw the Russian memes on Facebook. Not so crazy.
Yeah, not so crazy. Well, we're going to take a break right now so that you can read us a little bit from your book.
Okay. I'd now like to read a short passage from chapter 1 of my book On Disinformation. The first chapter is called Truth Killers. The storming of the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021 was an American tragedy. It was also completely predictable. The patriots in face paint, who carried sharpened flagpoles, bats, and zip ties into the Senate chamber, were the inevitable result of 70 years of lies about tobacco, evolution, global warming, and vaccines. After the truth killers provided a blueprint for how to deny scientific facts that clash with their financial or ideological interests, it was a small step for unscrupulous politicians to figure out how to use this strategy to lie about anything they wanted, such as the baseless claim that the 2020 presidential election was stolen, and that the January 6th insurrectionists were actually peaceful protesters, or that they were Antifa in disguise. Welcome to the world of reality denial, where truth is subordinate to ideology, feelings have more weight than evidence, and democracy hangs in the balance. Throughout history, autocratic leaders and their wannabes have understood that the quickest way to control a population is to control their information sources. But in a society that still has a free press, disinformation is the new censorship.
That's good. That's a good opening. So if you had just a couple, I know you have several ideas, but if you had just a couple of things that you were going to say to somebody on what to do to help fight disinformation, what would you say your top couple would be?
So this is a short book. You can read it in an hour. And at the end of the book, there are 10 practical steps that anybody can take. One point of disinformation is to make you feel powerless, but you're not powerless. There are things that we can actually do. The one single most important step is that you have to admit that we're in an information war. I can't tell you how many people don't know this, how many people don't understand that the United States has been in an information war with Russia for the last 20 years, and that they target us around scientific issues, but also other things that destabilize society, like lies about democracy or trying to swing an election. So that's the first step, and it may sound like it's the simplest step, but it's really not, because what you have to do is realize that we need to be on war footing. If you think it's a misinformation problem, then what can you do about it? Then it's just like a natural disaster. It's like a hurricane. Put your head down. You know, there's nothing you can do. But if we're actually in a war, then this is a war not just for our cyber warriors at the U.S. Army Cyber Institute. We're all in it every single day, and we need to arm up and figure out what we can do to fight back. This is an information war that could well determine the future of democracy in the United States.
Yeah, I spend time worrying about that.
Me too.
For sure. My last question I have for you is, do you have a library card?
That is a rough one, because I've had a library card my whole life. And I mean, yes, I have a university library card.
That counts.
But what I enjoy, and again, I can't remember who said this. Obviously somebody who is a bookseller. He said, if a book is worth reading, it's worth owning. So I buy the books that I want to read now. My son-in-law is a carpenter, and he built me the most wonderful bookshelves at the house that were, they look, you know, built in like, you know, they've been, it's a 100-year-old house, like they've been there forever. And it's been my delight over the last few years to just fill up those shelves with all the books. Most of them I've, you know, now read, but some of them are there. It's kind of like a wine cellar, you know, each book has its right time. And so I am at the point now where I really enjoy owning books. And the one thing that I'll tell people is, you can get On Disinformation at the library. The other thing that you can do is buy it and give it away. Give it to a friend. Yeah. I don't want people to necessarily do what I did, buy the book and put it on the shelf. I want you to pass it through a friend. Leave it in your Uber. Leave it on the bus. Pass it hand to hand. It's a small pocket book. You know, it's a manifesto. And I'm hoping that it gets around to more and more people. Libraries are wonderful, and you know, maybe 100 people will read the same book, and that's wonderful. But I enjoy owning books and then lending them out, as long as I know I'm going to get them back.
That's good, great. Well, thank you again so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it, and you're a wonderful guest. Pick up a copy of On Disinformation. It is definitely a fascinating read, for sure. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you join us again on A Novel Idea.